Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us and registering. It's great that we've had so many register and so many questions submitted in advance. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today, hopefully giving a useful overview of some of the key equality challenges we face, but more importantly, how we can use some of the key tools at our disposal to embed equality within the work that we do across the Union. So I'll just kick off with some introductions. Firstly, my name is Jenny Sherrard. I am the Head of Equality here at the University and College Union. I'm joined by some fantastic speakers. My colleague Jenny Lennox, who is a bargaining and negotiation official who's done lots of great work on many of the equality issues that our members face. I'm joined by Seth Atkin, who is one of our equality support officials, works in our quality team and leads on issues around LGBT+. And also by Victoria Shawmy, who is the chair of the Union's Higher Education Committee, as well as our Equality Committee and the Black Member Standing Committee. So lots of expertise to offer on all those different areas. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. And also thank you and welcome to Rebecca, who is our British Sign Language interpreter today. Before we kick off, just a couple of reminders. The session is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it back at a later date. We also do have closed captions available if you're watching us via the Facebook stream. The instructions for how to get your closed captions up have been provided, but they are available on the Facebook link specifically. And do please keep asking questions in the comments boxes as we go along. We've had lots of excellent questions submitted in advance, many of which we hope to get to as we go through today. But we will also try to incorporate a couple at the end if we have time. I'm going to kick us off today with a bit of a brief overview of some of the key tools and key legislation that we want to be thinking about whenever we think about how to really embed equality within our all of our work, but particularly within our negotiations and bargaining with employers. I think one of the key questions to kick off is really what do we mean by equality bargaining? I think that as one person who submitted a question in advance said, equality is a moral duty. We shouldn't have to be bargaining for it. But unfortunately, we know that the reality is that progress on achieving equality has been painfully slow in most of the areas we're concerned with. And much of the inequality is deeply rooted. So really what the purpose of today's session is to think about how we can embed equality within all our work. That's campaigning, organising, and through our bargaining and negotiations to keep the pressure on for meaningful change. So to sort of just begin thinking about some of the ways that we can do that, it's first of all really important to understand some of the detail about the legislation that underpins some of the equality work that we do. So there are different legislation in different parts of the UK, but one of the key pieces to be aware of is the Equality Act 2010. It's in operation in England, Wales and Scotland, and it provides specific protections against discrimination on the basis of 9 specific characteristics. The Equality Act also puts in place the public sector equality duty, which means that employers need to demonstrate that they're taking action on a number of ways that help to protect against discrimination. So they need to show and demonstrate that they are working to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation as it is outlined in the Act. They need to show that they are working to advance equality of opportunity between people who share protected characteristics and those who don't. And they also need to show that they are fostering good relations between people who share protected characteristics and those who don't. So that is a really helpful grounding which underpins a lot of the work that we do, because a lot of what we want to do in terms of equality bargaining is to hold employers to account on how well and how they are meeting that public sector equality duty. Although that duty doesn't apply in Northern Ireland, Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act does place similar responsibilities for institutions in Northern Ireland. And the equality duty does apply slightly differently in the different parts of the UK, but there's a really helpful summary of that on the Advanced HE website, which I will provide a link to in the comments. So that's the key piece of legislation. And while it isn't perfect, for example, it doesn't cover all the areas where we campaign and organise around equality, like migrant members. It does provide that that really helpful basis for holding employers to account on a lot of the issues that we are concerned with. So moving on to think about some of the key tools that we can use to help ensure that ask employers to demonstrate that they are meeting these duties. There are a few useful tools that it's probably just helpful to run through and make sure that people are aware of and thinking about how we might employ them in relation to a lot of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. So first off, I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of equality impact assessments. These are really, really important tools and very much considered best practice for ensuring that employers are demonstrating how they're meeting the public sector equality duty, but also for just providing a way of helping to remind us about the different things that we need to consider whenever we are looking at how well employers are meeting their equality duties. Although they're not compulsory, as I say, they are best practice, and we should be encouraging and putting pressure on employers to conduct them whenever any new policy or proposal is introduced. So, for instance, at the moment, we've got lots going on in relation to COVID and the changes to working practices. We unfortunately proposals for restructuring in some cases, and we need to be thinking about really putting pressure on employers to make sure that they are undertaking quality impact assessments on all of those proposals, so that and we have templates available on our equality page, which can help to make sure that you're keyed in and able to engage with that process properly. A couple of the other things it's worth mentioning in terms of other tools that we can use. There's a range of data that employers have to provide, particularly data around gender pay gaps. I'm not going to speak too much about data because Jenny is going to focus quite a lot on that in her contribution, but using the gender pay gap data to really highlight the sort of relative how well individual employers are doing relative to others, it can be a really helpful way of putting some pressure onto individual employers. And we also have equal pay audits at our disposal, a way of asking employers to look at the pay on promotion of women, Black members and disabled members, thinking about how pay differs between those different groups of people. And one of the other ways that we have to put some pressure on it and to ask and encourage employers to further embed equality within what they're doing is around charter marks. There are a range of charter marks out there, and we've got quite a helpful list on our website. Again, I'll post some links into the chat once I finish speaking. But the Race Equality Charter and Athena Swan are two of the key charter marks. While they're by no means a silver bullet for any of these issues, they are a useful way of engaging with employers and encouraging them to really think through in detail some of the actions that they need to take in order to embed equality and address particular equality issues. So that, again, as I say, I'll post a link into the chat box for how some of the detail around those. And then I think finally, in terms of some of the sort of whistle-stop tour of some key tools, is thinking about how we can get better engaged with institutions' own groups and things that they're doing internally in relation to equality and diversity. So making sure that we've got our reps and our members engaged on some of those internal groups, on EDI groups, and making sure that they're feeding back to the branch and thinking about how we can identify some of the issues that are being raised, not just by union members, but by staff across the organisation, and then thinking about how we tie those together. So those are just a few of the ways that we can, use some key tools to help put pressure on our employers. And I am going to sort of stop there and hand over to my colleague Jenny, who is going to run through some of the ways that we can use data that some of these tools provide to then help put pressure on employers. So I'm just going to take colleagues off the screen, and Jenny's got up a presentation as well. So I will just do that now. And
thank you. So I'm going to run a little bit through this presentation. I'm going to try and do it on 2 screens at once so I can kind of read through my notes. So apologies if I'm not looking directly at the screen. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the data that's available to inform negotiations. And actually some of this is what Jenny's already talked through. There are gender pay gap declarations. You should be able to get those off your institution's own website. This applies to colleges and universities in England with 250 or more employees, but there are also obligations to declare gender pay gaps in both Scotland and Wales, although there are slightly different requirements. There isn't a requirement in Northern Ireland, so I have to say that it's important to caveat it. And actually, as part of the kind of COVID-19 emergency measures, employers weren't required to declare their gender pay gaps this year, but actually you'd be surprised to see how many in our sector have done so. It's worth going onto the website at the bottom of this slide to go and check it out and see what they've already declared, and to look at past declarations as well, because you can track kind of where things have been going with gender pay gap. Equal pay audits should be conducted by your employers on a regular basis, really, because it's a way of them guaranteeing that they aren't breaching any obligations they have to pay men and women equally. But it's also kind of quite useful data, and I'm going to run through some of the stuff you might get from an equal pay audit more broadly to kind of look at where women sit within the workforce and where other groups sit within the workforce as well, because they should be looking across the protected characteristics in any kind of equal pay audit. Even an audit from a couple of years ago would be a really useful thing to look through, and it's worth kind of asking for those that information if you don't have it when you're confronted with an issue. I had also had a bit of a scout around on a few college and university websites, and the other sorts of things that you find up there are things like how the institution is meeting the public sector equality duty, race equality action plans, equality university annual reports, and all of that will have data in there, which is worth having a look through so you can better understand what's happening in your institution or in your college. So in terms of obtaining data, I know a lot of people are kind of quite keen to put in a freedom of information request, but actually, as a recognised trade union, you can request data under the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992. So it's always worth kind of asking, not just for financial data, which of course you should be asking for, but equality data to sit alongside that. Who is going to be impacted by the actions that they're deciding to take? It's really important to kind of be asking that. And I think whenever the new policy or practice is being brought in, a lot of employers will automatically do an equality impact assessment. Some won't, and it's worth asking for that. And I noticed there was a comment on the side, how do we make them do that? Well, we say this, how else are you going to prove that you're going to live up to the public sector equality duty? That's the very simple answer. They've got to carry out some kind of assessment to show that they're meeting those obligations. So, if they've done it, share it. If they haven't, what are they doing, and what else are they going to produce that you can use? So looking at some of the data you might get from an equal pay audit, this is looking at the distribution of staff by gender over the 4 quartiles of the workforce, so the 4 equal sections of the workforce. And you can see in this that women are the dominant part of the lowest paid quarter of the workforce, and that men are the highest paid. It's the sort of stuff we know is already happening, but it kind of spells out more clearly. You can also get that information from a gender pay gap data as well, because they're required to provide the gender pay gap by quartile as well. So you can kind of see some of that and how that pans out as well. It's quite useful data to see. And they also do that for gender pay gap on by quartile on bonuses as well. So again, you can see who's getting the bonuses and how they're distributed amongst the workforce. I think kind of the really important thing to look at when you're looking at this kind of data is just, where do women sit and who are going to be impacted in any change they make. So if they're going to make redundancies and that's going to affect people on the lowest grade, clearly that's going to disproportionately impact women over men. Move on to the next slide. So this is looking at by grade. And again, it's useful to get this breakdown because you can kind of see a slightly more detail about where it is that the people are sitting within the workforce, and again, the proportional impact on men and women. And you might be able to get this data for other protected characteristics as well. This is what this institution that we're using anonymised, of course, was able to provide. Here we've got a table about full and part-time staff, and then the gender pay gap for those workers. And actually, obviously, what we can see from here is that those on casualised and hourly pay contracts are much more likely to be women, and obviously they're worse paid. And you might want to get more data again on the breakdown of non-academic staff. So where in pre-92s we're representing academic-related professional services staff, you would want that to be broken down in a more sophisticated manner. But again, it's a useful kind of thing to be able to see that difference between part-time and full-time staff and how they sit from a gender perspective. And again, all of this stuff is the things you can kind of pick through when you're presented with an issue by the employer to see how it's going to impact. So moving on to looking at sort of bargaining scenarios, I thought I kind of picked two things that seem to be most relevant at the moment, but I'm sure people will have questions relating to other scenarios as well. So looking at the issue of reducing the number of casualised staff, and I think a lot of institutions are seeing this happening at the moment because employers think it's a really easy area to get rid of people, to cut headcount, to cut costs. But in fact, actually, what we do know, particularly in HE, from having looked through the data that's provided by the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, is that actually a lot more women and Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff are represented in the casualised group of staff. And in fact, I think we've put some figures out about this. We can give you on an institution basis if that would be helpful. But it clearly shows that if they cut casualised staff, then that will have a disproportionate impact. And therefore, how are they upholding the public sector equality duty? They're not. They're failing to do that quite catastrophically. Again, what's the age profile of those workers? And I think we need to be asking, really basically, what is the saving? A lot of time when people cut the headcount by cutting off casualised staff, all they're doing is just saving up a problem that will later be revisited. So they'll be bringing people back because they just won't be able to cope with the workloads, or things won't get done. And we have to be asking, it's not just the saving, but what are they expecting? What work are they expecting not to happen as a result of this? And employers are very bad at often saying what it is that they're expecting not to occur. But I know that we found, particularly in some FE colleges, when you actually look at the cost of the savings that could be made by bringing those staff onto permanent contracts, actually, it would be more advantageous to do that. And obviously, they would be able to sustainably provide the services they promise to the students. And if you weigh that off against redundancy payments, they're all upfront costs that institutions have to find there and then in order to go ahead with any kind of redundancy process. And there will be casualised staff who are entitled to redundancy payments. There will be people who have been on casualised contracts for years and years and years, and we will be able to argue legitimately that those people are entitled to redundancy payments. So it's worth kind of trying to get them to break this down from a financial, but also from an equality perspective. I think I kind of covered off those are the questions that you put there. But it is just, it's worth kind of asking these questions because a lot of the time the employer will not have the answers to them and they should have gone off and done it. And frankly, if they can't answer that, there's an opportunity for us to embarrass them and say, look, they're embarking on this process of cutting casualised staff, but we can demonstrate actually what they're doing is they're taking away, more people are being called who are female, who are Black, and who are all, younger workers, for example. And that's a really good opportunity for us to embarrass if that's where we have to go to get action. So looking at another bargaining scenario, I know I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago talking about online teaching policy, and it's something else that obviously is coming up quite a lot for our members at the moment. We need to sort of start with real basics on this and have there be done a risk assessment for this activity. Now, some employers will be saying this isn't new activity, but obviously the place that it's happening, usually your home, is a new place for it to be happening, and therefore it clearly needs a proper risk assessment, and we need to be putting pressure on them to do that. But also, how does that impact individuals? So there will be some individuals who have find it easier to access, get onto the internet, all the rest. Some people who have specific problems, some people have home working conditions that will make that difficult. All of this stuff is stuff that the employer is supposed to look at. And obviously that has then an equality set of impacts. So you'll probably find that there are both students and staff who find it more difficult to access and have an appropriate working environment. And that has to be something the employer takes into account. And again, kind of looking at the issues around kind of BAME workers within that as well. We know that there's been a disproportionate impact with COVID-19, BAME workers. Will they be the people who end up being forced back to go to work in a college or in a university? And will they be facing greater exposure? All those kind of questions we have to unpack. And obviously staff who have disabilities as well, what kind of position are we putting them in? The employer has an obligation to health and safety legislation to be making sure they're safe at work. So we need to be asking those questions, how that fits in with the equality issues. It's a big part of that. I'm just trying to see if there was anything else I kind of put down in my notes here. Probably worth just saying that if they kind of carry on the course, which is about innately discriminating, then that might present an opportunity for us to legally challenge them. So that's what part of the reason we're building up this kind of data, to put pressure on them, either with public exposure or perhaps with some kind of legal action if we feel what they're doing isn't appropriate. And it does have an impact on employers, what things might happen. So the Leeds University did an equality impact assessment on a new online teaching policy, and as a result of it, they discovered that by asking the teaching staff to oversee the subtitles that were being added to recordings, they were actually massively increasing workload, and they thought that might have a disproportionate impact on those with disabilities or those with caring responsibilities, and so they made a decision to take that aspect of the online learning off the individual teaching staff. So it can change things, and we shouldn't be entirely negative about that opportunity. And that's me. I'll hand back to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Moving on, I'm going to introduce Seth Atkin, who's going to give a bit of an overview of some of the less obvious things that we might want to be thinking about when it comes to equality in terms of the sectors where we organise. So over to you, Seth.
Hi, thank you. There are areas of equality that are not so obvious to people and kind of go dark quite a bit, either because they've not got a visible distinction, that they are ingrained into the culture of society, that they're more complex than current equality law campaigns and organising account for. I'll go through those in a bit more detail. For example, hidden stroke invisible disabilities perhaps accounts for the majority of disabilities. A survey in the USA showed that 74% of the respondents who identified as disabled had invisible hidden disabilities. These are not easily recognised, and a person may not need an external aid to support them, such as hearing aid or wheelchair. This includes people with chronic health conditions, mental health, learning disabilities. Organising to support people with hidden invisible disabilities involves becoming aware of conditions, how society presents barriers to people with such conditions, providing space for people to talk about how they experience work and outside of work, the impact and the presentation of barriers that feel that they're disabled people. So it's really providing a space for voice and ensuring that people can actually talk about their experiences and be heard. Intersectionality, which is rather more complex than equality law at this time recognizes, because equality law right now is based on the recognition of single discrimination on an individual protected characteristic. For example, disability, race, sex, sexual orientation, and others. People's lives cut across these protected characteristics. For example, a Black woman, an HIV positive gay man. People may experience discrimination differently because of having more than one protected characteristic. The classic example of this in the workplace is Black people could be employed in engineering, whilst women could be employed in admin. Data would show employment stats for both groups, but it's not that there were no women in engineering and no Black people in admin. Therefore, structural inequalities were not shown up in that data, and Black women could be unfairly discriminated against. So there's a need to unpick data to really reveal this kind of problem. Intersectional organising involves listening to diverse experiences within equality groups, not treating each equality group as a homogeneous unit. For example, way back in the 19th century, Sojourner Truth argued for Black women's experience to be included in women's struggles. This was a time when women's issues were dominated by a white middle-class agenda for obvious reasons in terms of their not being included. However, Black voices were not being heard, and Sojourner Truth was campaigning for that to happen. Again, it also involves digging down into the data to look at the cross-section. Support from equality law may mean choosing one of the protected characteristics for a case. So if somebody was presenting with a case of discrimination, somebody taking up that case, a caseworker, may need to choose a case to fight on, or if they were all of equal worth, to launch several cases. However, Section 14 of the Equality Act did try to deal with this to some extent by looking at dual characteristics, taking up two protected characteristics at a time. But this was not implemented. So we're back at the case where one has to choose which protected characteristic one takes to fight the discrimination case. So intersectionality will be able to deal with that and provide space for people to talk about their real lives and their real experiences of discrimination. Hetero and cis normativity. Norms are ingrained into culture. There's been a lot of talk about that over the summer. People can be unaware of them, but these norms can be very oppressive and exclusionary. For an example, curriculum that does not include Black people's voices and LGBT plus people's voices is a real problem. UCU has addressed decolonization of the curriculum in another Fund the Future event. LGBT plus inclusion has just been announced in Scotland. It's going to become the first nation in the world to put LGBT plus history on the curriculum. Kind of underlining that celebratory thing a bit. It's the first nation in the world to do so, to talk about LGBT plus people's history. Hetero and cis normativities make assumptions about the lives of LGBT plus people based on the experience of those who are not LGBT plus, straight people and cisgender people. This can include assumptions about relationships, family life, caring responsibilities. There's a real need to give voice to these and show how they can be experienced differently by LGBT plus people. The recent changes for inclusion of LGBT plus people since 2003, when protections were brought in for LGBT plus people in the workplace, can mean that historical prejudices still exist in the collective and individual psyche. So that really needs checking. The lives and responsibilities of LGBT plus people should not be assumed. There should be experiences taken into account, and those discriminations that LGBT plus people should be given space to be talked about. LGBT plus people may need to feel that their voices will be heard and experiences will be taken seriously, largely because they've been used to putting up and shutting up. That can apply across the board to those things which are not obvious. One can make choices about what one comes out as, talks about in terms of experience, puts in the background to not talk about because they feel it won't be taken seriously. This presents a real issue as a historical one where employers might say, well, we don't have any of them here, so it's not a problem here. Well, that in itself is a problem, because that means people may well not have declared, which is a really big issue, because in order to actually be covered by equality law, one needs to declare. So it relates to hidden and invisible disabilities, to intersectionality, to LGBT+. So questions: how can you call out assumptions, attitudes, practices that are in your institution? How can you enable your branch to be seen as a safe space for people who might not talk about their disabilities, their areas of discrimination, their disabilities, their intersectionality, their LGBT+ identities? How can you enable them to talk and share with people in your branches? People with hidden invisible disabilities, multiple protected characteristics, and who are from groups that are not readily visible in GLGBT will probably have unique perspectives on policies and practices of the institution. How are these perspectives brought into any assessment of equality impact? Is there meaningful consultation? Are there safe spaces for people to give voice to their concerns that then feed into meaningful bargaining and negotiations? How can the branch enable people to be heard in ways that are not tokenistic? Challenging culture along these lines can help prevent cases of discrimination, and that is vitally important. Calling back to 2003, 2010, to relevant dates there, employment discrimination, LGBT people, and also the 2010 Equality Act that did have dual discrimination written in. These are quite recent in terms of societal development. So these are things that really need working on, bringing to the fore, so that the voices, experiences can be heard effectively. Thank you.
Super, thank you so much, Seth. That's really helpful, and I think that the point there around the need to really, think how we are bringing intersectionality to the fore and making sure that it is embedded within our approaches is a really important one. I'm going to move on now and bring in Dr. Victoria Schonely, who is going to speak to us for a few minutes, and then after that we'll move on to a bit of Q&A. So over to you, Victoria. I think you're on mute. So.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Hope you're well, or good afternoon. Okay, so thanks, Jenny, for that. Well, quickly, I suppose what I want to say is just build on what both Jenny and Seth have actually said. My research itself as a researcher and academic is on intersectionality and what that actually means. But when we think about negotiating, bargaining and negotiating, we need to think about it through an equality lens. And as it's been pointed out, what does that mean? It means that we really need to understand the disproportionality of what's taking place when we are bargaining for jobs, when we're bargaining also for issues of equality within the higher education sector. That's really important. Having a real understanding when you're one of the caseworkers, or whether you are an officer within a local branch or a national branch, is important. Understanding that being comfortable with the terminology and being comfortable of where to find the data, where to find the data which is equality driven. So if you are faced with understanding or knowing that Black women are at the bottom of the pile when it comes to wages, that's important to know. Whether that's a Black woman which has got a disability, because we use the word disability, but we don't actually use a lens to look at disability, then it has to have a racial lens as well. Whether it's a Black woman, I'm using Black women as a starter, or whether when we think about LGBTQI and we look at, well, what does that do for people of color through that particular lens? Every lens we look at has to be through an equality lens when we're looking at negotiating, bargaining for our members
Really, really important. And for that to happen, we need to be really skilled up, knowledged to be able to do this. It's not something you can do on the hoof, because it's talking about dependency on our work and what happens to our members itself. Now, as Jenny said, I had a couple of minutes out of all of you. So I'm going to hand back to Jenny, and we can actually have some questions.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, I think that's right. Really bringing that equality lens to the fore as we take forward our work is crucial. I'm bringing back everyone onto the screen, because I think I'm going to move on to some Q&A now. Thanks all for the really helpful contributions. And I think it would be really good to just take some questions that we had submitted in advance. So the first one that we had through that we wanted to touch on today was really about thinking how that differentiation between campaigning and negotiations and management. I think that, obviously we need to make sure that our work is complementary, and that we are joining up the dots between the different aspects of our work and how we're embedding equality. So I guess it would just be useful to sort of hear from the panel any thoughts you've got. Maybe Jenny, if I can hand over to you in the first instance.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's probably important to differentiate kind of headline data and kind of the real detailed stuff, because actually the headline data is the sort of stuff you want to use in campaigning. It's the sort of stuff that can kind of focus minds. So if you're talking about a gender pay gap of 18%, let's say, that's something that focuses people's minds. It makes them realise that the place that they're working in has a massive issue around gender pay. And that's the kind of stuff that you definitely want to use in campaigning. And when we were talking earlier about some of the stuff that you might kind of pick out in response to redundancies, for example, if you had a headline that, I don't know, 54% of people who were, and I'm clicking this figure off on the top of my head, but 54% of people who were on casualised contracts were in fact Black, Asian or minority ethnic, then obviously that's a headline you're going to use. And you might use that not just amongst your staff internally, but also externally as well. It's the sort of stuff you want to publicise, because that's the stuff that can really embarrass. But when you get into the detail of it, I mean, there are times that you want to have that kind of detailed discussion amongst branch members. Perhaps it'll highlight issues you hadn't considered before, and maybe it'll give you an opportunity to bring together groups of workers you haven't thought about bringing together before. So I think sometimes we kind of have very big generic branch meetings, but we don't necessarily think about how we focus that down, how we talk to staff who've got disabilities, how we talk to Black workers, etc. And maybe you will want to use some of that data for that. But you're kind of wanting to use the really detailed data, I think, when it comes to negotiations, because actually the employer's gone to the extent of doing maybe an equality impact assessment to prove that it's meeting its obligations under the public sector equality duty. And yet what you've discovered by doing that equality impact assessment is actually, they're about to make their workforce even less diverse than it was in the first place, perhaps. So that's the kind of time you need to pick through those little bits and see where there are policies that can be changed, proposals that can be tweaked that actually will make a really fundamental difference. And I think it's really useful in that context as well, I think, to make sure, and I hope today there are not just people who are equality reps watching this, but also people who are doing the main part of negotiations, to bring in your equality reps and to always be thinking about what is the equality angle we need to be discussing in this. A lot of what we're dealing with at the moment, I think, is going to be the employers approaching us about changes to practices or cuts to jobs or all that kind of stuff. And so obviously that's got to be our response, think what's the equality angle on this. But we've got to be thinking much more proactively about what things we can meaningfully do, I think, to advance the issues on equality. So I know that people right now will be engaging much more with the Black Lives Matter movement. I will probably come on to talk about it a bit more, but have we got together our Black members and talked to them about what things they would like to change, and could we be proactively campaigning on those issues, and could we be pulling together a list of demands? So we can use that data, I think, really, really well to have a good discourse with members and to have a meaningful and effective discourse in management.
Thanks, Jenny. Do either Victoria or Seth, do you want to come in? Yeah, come in, Victoria.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. So just really quickly, I think the important about data and how data in itself is hidden. And I think that's something we need to understand. And so even using the terminology, which many of us Black members are very, very concerned about, BAME, is not useful to understand what the data is for African, Caribbean, or Asian, for example, because that using that terminology just is everything which is non-white British. And so we need to move away from that. We don't know how it got into the system in the first place, but it's not helpful. It's not helpful when we're looking at headline discussions like Jenny just mentioned, because if we really wanted to talk about, okay, if you take a university, and you look at perhaps Teach First or school directs, some of the areas around teacher education, and you're wanting some organizations, some universities are actually walking away from Teach First, for example. Now, what the data perhaps within that could mention is, one, have they had an impact assessment? And if they have, they'll see that the disproportionate numbers of staff which were maybe working in those particular areas, i.e. schools direct programs or Teach First, would be the ones who are losing their jobs. So if you take school direct, for example, this is just an example, there could be numbers of marginalized groups on that program which will not be on that program, which is adding the diverse groups of students and staff in that program. But because we're using BAME, we can't get down to that. And because there has been no impact assessment done on some of these, we also can't find that out as well. And I think they are important points which we need to understand as when we negotiate bargaining through an equality lens. That's just one point. I tried to make it very, very short. Okay, back to you, Jenny.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful point. And I think that, as we sort of said earlier on, equality impact assessments aren't absolutely mandatory. But I think in some ways that leaves us with some scope to really put pressure on about what they should look like and how, what detail and data that we are actually after from our employers. And I think that some of those, addressing some of those points that Victoria and Jenny have spoken about the need for really granular data on, and it speaks to Seth's point around intersectionality as well. There's an opportunity for us to be, I think, quite innovative about how we go about seeking data from employers and being able to capture some of those more complex aspects of the equality agenda. I think
it's worth saying actually, and it's good that Victoria picked me up on it, that actually a lot of employers will be able to break it down in more detail. They'll be able to tell you whether or not somebody is black and a UK passport holder, or whether or not they're from another country. They will be able to break that down in a lot more detail. And in fact, particularly in HE, we know that the data that's declared to the Higher Education Statistic Agency breaks that down a great deal more. So I've kind of glossed over the whole thing, but actually there is an awful lot more data we can pick through, and employers are able to provide that. And we're going to probably talk a little bit more about how good quality data you can get for all the kind of protected characteristics. But actually for race, there is probably a much better breakdown that the employers are able to give.
Mm. I think the other point I was just going to sort of say is I think when it comes to the sort of campaigning and negotiations and how we use data in different ways for different things, I think we need to think about what an employer's motivation for change is. I think that's a really important part of the equation. There's carrot and there's stick in this equation. So we need to obviously reinforce that the employers have a moral duty. They have a legal duty under the Public Sector Equality Act. But there's also, the business case for the fact that, proving themselves to be, good employers that do seek to promote these things will make them more attractive to a wider group of potential recruits. And so, I think that we need to think about how we tap into the different motivations that employers have, and think about, whether there's definitely a role for threats of negative publicity, where there are some of those big headlines that Jenny talked about, but also, where sort of issues are being identified, thinking about how we can, really put forward a case that if we work together, we can make this better, and think about how we can use that as a more sort of carrot-y type approach as well. So those are really helpful inputs and contributions. Thank you to everyone. Seth, do you want to add anything before we move on to the next question?
Data is a real issue for LGBT plus people because of the lack of routine collection of it. A plus side on that one is that for the very first time in 2021, the national census will be asking questions around sexual orientation and gender identity. So hopefully we will start getting somewhere there. And that might be a way to get more data in employment, in to institutions. I think impact assessments can fulfill a role here in terms of actually talking and listening with people. And I think what Jenny said about who we are listening to, who we are talking to, is really important. So there are kind of other ways of getting data than the kind of institutional data, which I think is really crucial for those areas where it's not being covered. But digging down, so crucial for showing experience and not just kind of glossing things over, which of course employers would, in some senses, like to do.
Super. Thank you, Seth. If we can move on to the next question then. We had very topical and obviously on a lot of members' minds at the moment. How can we effectively be bargaining for equality issues during COVID-19? I think that there's lots to unpack here, and we know that the COVID pandemic has vastly differential impacts on different groups of members and staff. And so I'd just be really interested to hear from the panel on some thoughts on this. Seth, perhaps if I can go to you first and then we can bring the others in.
Yeah, thank you. I think COVID has really shown what I've been talking about in relation to hidden and invisible disabilities. It's really shown how important it is to understand the impact of hidden invisible disabilities on people and how people are disabled by their health conditions, etc., because of various things which are or not in place in society. The UCU's already done quite a bit of work on the impact of COVID, so that's available on the website. That's worth looking at. There are surveys that have been done and are forthcoming, so there's quite a bit of material there. A recent one includes LGBT plus and mental health. So there are areas which are being revealed through this COVID period and the impact of the restrictions that actually can help to give some voice to issues which otherwise might not be being covered effectively, and therefore be engaged in terms of negotiations, bargaining with employers by revealing that kind of information. That's
really helpful. Thanks, Seth. Jenny, Victoria, do you want to maybe?
Yeah, I'd like to speak actually. Yeah. So I think this is a really crucial one around the way of bargaining for equality issues. If I've got a list of things, I'll just go through very, very, very quickly because my time is very limited. One is around the impact of BME, Black and minority ethnic members, whether that's across FE or HE. Let's use both because the UCU stands for both. And whether that's when we're thinking about coming back into work or whether we're in work, whether that's for students or whether that's for staff. I think that's really important when we're talking about research staff, whether we're talking about full-time staff, casualized staff, etc. The other thing as well is to consider what's going on with gender and COVID and the amount of women now which are working from home but also trying to do a job as an academic, plus also they're looking after their children and taking on that board, which has an impact for the ref. For HE, I think that's something which we need to look at, because when we're looking at promotions and what that means, how men are able to write more papers because of the fact that they aren't looking after the children if they've got children, or they're not doing the caring responsibilities. That's something which needs to be considered. Mental health issues are rife, especially amongst, and there's no real data on what's going on with Black staff members, which are part of UCU, whether that's in FE, whether that's in prison education, adult education, or higher education. Where's the research on that? And another thing which really, really is disturbing is the amount of people who want to do research in the area, which of course is really, really something important, but don't see it as that something which is they're passionate about. They're doing it because it's yet another opportunity to get another paper or another research grant. And I think we need to really be very aware of that. It's something we've picked up when people are doing research in the area of Black and minority areas, and how much of the ethical implications are on that, where they involve people which are actually involved or had experience of what's happening in their communities around COVID-19. I think we do need to ensure that when we're doing research that we include those people's voices as well. I've said a couple of minutes. I'll move on to your next thing, Jenny. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, I mean, I think the other sort of point that I would raise around this is that I think we need to be thinking about equality issues in lots of different ways, because I guess we think about equality in relation to changes to working practices, but we need to be thinking about how some of the safety measures that are being brought in workplaces to actually protect staff also have equality impacts. And so, I think that's maybe one of the less obvious things to think about, but it's really important that, if there's shifts to, more working from home, that we all, that is to protect particular staff who are more at risk. Actually, have we done an equality impact assessment on that as well? And that comes back to that point around intersectionality as well. So I think that there's lots of different ways that this is manifesting at the moment. It's really important to think about it in the round. Jenny, is there anything you want to add before we move on?
I was just going to say very quickly that we have done a seminar on sort of returning to the workplace and risk assessments. I know people have been asking about that in the bar. I mean, the reality is that the employers are supposed to do a risk assessment for every individual, and then they're supposed to do a risk assessment for every new activity. And those things are their legal obligations under Health and Safety at Work Act. So yes, employers should be doing this. They should be talking to individuals about their individual circumstances as well. And that's a really important thing. And I think we've sort of gone through the experience of lockdown, and now we're talking about return to work and what's that going to look like, or phased home working, etc. I think we've got to be really alive to the fact that there are going to be workers who are going to be really struggling come September with trying to juggle expectations to be returning to the physical workplace whilst also having to maybe juggle caring responsibilities. I think the return to school for schools and kids at school is going to actually be a really difficult thing for people to negotiate right now. So we've got to be asking those questions, and we've got to be putting on pressure on the employers to do what they have to do in terms of individual staff, because it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be experienced in the same way across the piece. And then you've got added on top of that, you've got, as has been highlighted by others, people who have disproportionately been exposed perhaps to the pandemic amongst Black and minority ethnic workers, and obviously those with hidden disabilities as well. So it's important right now for us to be continuing to ask those questions about how does any plan or any new practice have an impact on individual workers as well as collectively.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try and get a couple more questions in. We're almost at time. It's whizzed past this hour. But I think if we could maybe move on to another issue that's been really, in the news and in all of our minds recently, the issue of Black Lives Matter and how we can really raise awareness and understanding of what inequality looks like. I think, Victoria, you've touched on some of this. Do you maybe want to come back in on this question?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Thanks, Jenny. Black Lives Matter, something which I've been involved with for many years. How can UCU be involved with this and support this? I think the first thing which UCU, I believe should do is really acknowledge that even though it's a union and it's doing some very, very good work, there are going to be gaps. And I think we need to acknowledge that there are going to be gaps and actually feel, so where are those gaps? And what can we do to strengthen the work to ensure that we're able to support Black Lives Matter, not through a rhetoric way, but actually through a way that is really meaningful, that Black lives within the union absolutely matter 100%. And I think that's the first thing. I think also to understand, don't feel the discomfort that I don't understand. Speak up and say, do you know what? I'm putting my hand up. I don't know what it means. I don't actually understand. And allow people to have the mic which aren't white. All right. And when I say to understand, really, really say, do you know what? I don't know what that means. I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know what that is. Because I think the difficulty is if you're trying to support Black Lives Matter movement through the UCU lens, it has to start with you as ourselves, as officers, as members, as officials. We have to start with ourselves of what that actually means. And if we're too nervous to put our faces out there or to say we don't know because we don't want to be called racist, there's an issue there. I think we need to ensure that we start to get the conversation going around Black Lives Matter within our union and not think, oh, that's just a race card. They're just talking off cut. Whether you're in Cornwall, whether you're in Scotland, whether you're in Ireland, whether you're in Wales, wherever it is, You need to feel we can have this conversation. It doesn't have to be a conversation which Black people are doing. It has to be a conversation which white and Black are doing. And I'm using white and Black because that's just what we're doing at the moment. We need to feel confident that we can have that conversation and not feel that we're going to be beaten up. It's actually feeling confident that UCU allows a critical conversation. I think that's what I want to say. I know I've spoken again a little bit more, but I think this is important for us to really acknowledge, speak up, listen. I'd say listen, speak up, listen again, and ask.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you, Victoria. And I think we would all absolutely endorse exactly what you just said. One thing I will point to, which I think is really helpful for starting some of those conversations that you've talked about, is the branch resource pack that we put together on building anti-racist environments, which is available on our Equality webpage. And I think it's a really helpful little pack that provides some starters for 10 on how we can get some of those conversations going and think about reflecting not only on our own practices but also the practice of our institutions. And so I would definitely check that out. Again, I'll pop the link into the chat box in the description afterwards. Seth, do you want to, or Jenny, do you want to come in? Seth, perhaps?
Well, I was going to add something quickly because I suppose this is how my mind always works. But I think that we should be looking at whether there's a chance for the branch to be doing something proactive in response to Black Lives Matter. You know, do they call a meeting and specifically talk about that issue and talk about some of the work that we could be asking the institution to undertake? So there are institutions right now that are producing race pay gaps. I think somebody in the chat talked about the pay gap in their institution, actually saying it was positive. A positive gap in favour of Black and minority ethnic workers, but actually that's an opportunity to have a bigger conversation, which, as Victoria said, is unpack that. What does that look like? Is that non-UK residents? Is that, and is that Black workers? Is that workers from Asian heritage backgrounds? So you could be asking those sort of questions. An employer should have done an equal pay audit. So this is the time to ask those questions and go and be asking for the data we've kind of already been talking about. But I think there's many times that we will see that policies just don't really look at the experiences of Black workers. And I think there will be lots of people in your branch who will have identified something that they've been working on for a while and never thought to raise it. Maybe this is the time for us to do it. We could be asking for quite small things, but they could make really big changes of individual people's experiences. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to be thinking about proactively about what we can push for in terms of change. And every win is a win, isn't it? And every win makes us feel like we can do more and achieve more. And so I think it's really important for us now to be kind of part of that dialogue with members, really, to see what opportunities there are.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Seth?
Yeah, I really like what Victoria was talking about in terms of listening. And what Jenny's just said also about the proactive opportunities here, about providing space, about organising, working with members to provide opportunities to pass on the mic to enhance the voice of Black members in terms of the Black Lives Matter. And that will enable that listening, the talking to happen. It's key in terms of intersectionality, to be listening to the diversity that exists within the voices and to seek that out. So it's something that can be really done effectively. It doesn't just apply to this moment of Black Lives Matter and the movement of Black Lives Matter going forward, but also in relation to events of national consequence, such as Black History Month, Disability History Month, LGBT plus History Month, linking on to those and really, instead of a kind of tokenistic waving of a flag, look at what can you do to enhance voice to happen, put forward people who are willing to talk and share and share those experiences. So discourse, dialogue, awareness raising, etc., can effectively be done and not just stop at whatever the local network might be doing. There are some very effective ones and others not so. So there's quite a lot that can be done utilizing Black Lives Matter and other events international consequence.
That's great. Thank you, Seth. I think that those have all been really, really helpful contributions, and I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. Perhaps if I could ask each of the speakers to give us a sort of parting thought, and then we can round up. Perhaps if I start with you, Jenny, and we sort of just go round and sort of a final thought from each of you.
I guess for me, it's always take every opportunity you've got, really. I went for the first time to the Equality Reps conference actually last year, and I was really impressed by the reps we have, but I don't often feel they're part of the central negotiations that are being done by other members of the branch. And actually, it's a real opportunity to bring them in and be asking the questions that you perhaps don't think of, because what you're being confronted with is a load of redundancies. So we need to use the reps we've got more effectively, I think, quality reps. And we just need to be thinking every single time about anything that we're discussing with the employer. Is there something in this that we haven't considered? Are there voices in this we haven't heard? And is there something we can be doing to make sure that our workplace is somewhere that actually supports all staff? And I mean, there's a bigger point, and I've kind of said this quite frequently, but I do think that we need to be thinking much more about working with employers to create safe spaces where people feel able to talk about who they are and where they're from, and all of their protected characteristics, and not feel afraid to do that. And if we can kind of create those sorts of environments, and it's a terribly difficult thing, and I'm not the best person to speak about it, but I think if we're working on doing that, then we have better data that we can use to identify where there are problems and how we can work to address them.
Thank you. Seth, come to you next.
Yeah, my contribution is yes, Jenny, absolutely. All of that, definitely. Listening, talking, and utilising the experiences of our members. Excellent. It's a really good way forward. And then engaging with the other equality activities we have, Equality Conference, Equality Reps, etc.
Victoria, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I do have actually. Yep. Okay. So as I said, listen, talk, and action through an equality lens. But at the same time, think about the students and the curriculum, decolonizing the curriculum. Think about the staff as a whole staff, what that means, whether it's the person at reception, whether it's the security in reception, or whether it's to do with the staff which are involved with the facilities, or whether it's the academic staff and they're doing the research or the teaching, whether that's to do with recruitment, whether it's to do with promotion, or whether it's to do when you're wanting to kind of reduce the staff work size, what that looks like when you actually do it. Always use an equality lens across an intersectional approach. If you do that, then we know we're in the right place. If you don't do that, you're not in the right place. So I'm ending with listen, talk, and action through an equality lens. I think that's what we stand for with UCU.
I think those were all absolutely fantastic points. I really appreciate the time that all of you've given today. I hope that all of you watching have found this to be a really useful session. I suppose my parting thought is we can often focus on the bad stuff, but if you've got good practice, tell us, because it's great to be able to share that as well. And I think that Jenny said it earlier, every win counts and every win is getting us forward. So, I think that let's keep the momentum up. Let's share the good practice where we do have it. And yeah, hopefully this has helped to inspire some of you today. I'd just like to thank the speakers again and thank Rebecca for interpreting for us during the session. We will circulate a summary of some of the key points and links to everyone who registered. And I think if you've got further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. There are also a few other excellent webinars out there to tune into. If you visit the Fund the Future webpage, you can find a whole host of things. We had a couple recently on decolonizing institutions. We had one on disability, and we've got one coming up on Wednesday on issues faced by migrant members as well. So, thanks for joining us. Check out the other broadcasts and get in touch if you've got questions and comments. And thank you very much for joining us. Thanks.